My name is Julie Macfarlane and I'm a professor of law at the University of Windsor and the director of the National Self-Represented Litigants Project. I am proud to introduce Donald Best, who is the recipient of this year's Civil Liberties Award. Donald is an excellent choice to receive this honor. He is an indefatigable campaigner against corruption in all its forms, in the police, in the courts, and in legal practice. Now, I'm a law professor, but I would be naive not to acknowledge that corruption exists and persists in all these quarters. My own relationship with Donald has come about as a result of his experience as a self-represented litigant. Many people have miserable experiences as self-represented litigants, and I'll say more about that later. But Donald did not just have a miserable experience. Donald went to jail. As a result of untrue statements made by lawyers in a civil case that turned in part on whether Donald had been served with legal documents, he was held in contempt of court. He was overseas at the time. When Donald returned to Canada shortly after this, he searched unsuccessfully for a lawyer to represent him and place evidence before the court, showing that in fact he was not served with these documents. Donald knew by this point that if he was unsuccessful, he would likely be imprisoned for contempt. But no lawyer would represent him against another lawyer. His blog on this experience, which is called "The Client Lawyers Most Fear and Won't Represent at Any Price," for the National Self-Represented Litigants blog, was the most widely read blog of all those we published last year, 2017, and our blogs get very widely read. And I want to read just one paragraph from his blog, describing the search for a lawyer to represent him in saying that the lawyers on the other side of the case had been untruthful. He says this: "Many of the young lawyers I approached were sympathetic and forthright, even admitting that they were ashamed to have to turn me down. They explained that they dared not take my case because they feared the professional and social sanctions that would certainly result. Some cited conflict of interest involving past colleagues and law firms, while others explained that they regularly received work from the large Bay Street firms where these lawyers were from and could not afford to jeopardize that source of business. And a surprising number of lawyers," Donald goes on, "told me that it was their firm's policy not to litigate against lawyers or to bring motions or evidence that would harm the careers of other lawyers." So Donald went on to represent himself, and he was convicted of contempt and he was imprisoned. Donald's story touched a nerve, I think, that we see in just how widely read that blog was, because so many Canadians are experiencing poor and even unethical practice from some lawyers, and they continue to be relatively powerless in that battle. So I'm going to pivot now and say a little more about our organization, the National Self-Represented Litigants Project. Donald is a big supporter and cheerleader for the NSRLP, as we call it, and he asked me to make this introduction in order that I could say something about the work of the NSRLP to those present to see him receive the Civil Liberties Award. The NSRLP exists because of the huge number of Canadians who are going to court alone without a lawyer because they cannot afford the cost of legal services. The gap between those eligible for public legal aid and those who can afford to pay at a rate of $350 an hour upwards is now so large it includes most of us. The figures are horrifying. More than half the people coming to family court across Canada now are coming without a lawyer, and that number is close to 80% in urban centres like Vancouver and Toronto. In the civil courts, we see 30 to 40% of people present without a lawyer. And my own national research study that reported in 2013 concluded that the majority of those who are coming to court without a lawyer are doing so for a very simple reason. They can't afford to pay, or they have begun with a lawyer and they have simply run out of money to go on paying. The same finding has been found in studies in the United States, in England and Wales, Australia, New Zealand, and most recently Northern Ireland. It's about the money. So the NSRLP has three core mandates. Those are continuing research on the impact of what we call the self-represented litigants phenomenon, resources and advocacy. We work very hard to encourage dialogue among members of the justice system, the insiders, if you like, and those on the outside looking in, like Donald. We recently held a dialogue event featuring a whole number of stakeholders, which I know Donald is going to refer to in his acceptance speech. In many ways, what happened to Donald as a self-represented litigant reflects themes that I see in the experiences on a daily basis in our contact with self-represented litigants. The story I've seen play out over and over again in the 7 years now that I've been working with SRLs, self-represented litigants, is that those who are more powerful in the justice system, the insiders, lawyers and judges, are discomforted by the influx of ordinary Canadians, and they are sometimes unwilling to recognize why they're representing themselves, and they have a hard time admitting to being wrong or making mistakes. Some of those insiders feel that they have to maintain their power by denying any wrongdoing, just like the lawyers in Donald's case did, and in the way that entitled and powerful groups do, believe, and I think wrongly, that if they just keep the fences up and circle the wagons, this problem of self-represented litigants will go away. The consequences of justice system insiders being unable to admit or acknowledge wrongdoing are sometimes very, very bad, as they were for Donald Best. The NSRLP exists to try to bring attention to this power disparity between the insiders and those who come without expert assistance to court, the outsiders. We are always looking for allies inside the justice system, and there are some. I want to underscore that, and the dialogue event that we held recently really underscored that. It included judges and lawyers who really understand that this is an important issue that the profession and the courts now have to face. And those insider supporters also need our support because they're swimming against the tide. They're under pressure not to be sympathetic to this problem, but to shore up the barricades. We still have a very long way to go in recognizing the need for justice system reform and the imperative of listening to the voices of those who may be powerless, but they are angry and they have something important to say and they are not going away. I want to end by paying tribute to Donald's fortitude, perseverance, and commitment to better access to justice in Canada. I am proud to call Donald Best my friend, and the NSRLP is proud to have his support. Thank you.